Drop the knife, right now. Drop the knife. Drop it.
5 hours after police officers first arrived at a senior housing complex in downtown Burlington for a report of an elderly man threatening to kill people, 76-year-old Ralph Phil Grennan lay dying on an ambulance gurney.
We wanted to make sure that the
Moments earlier, he'd been shot 4 times by police. The investigation would confirm Grennan suffered from paranoid schizophrenia, had stopped taking medication, and refused all pleas to put down 2 large kitchen knives. After police tasers didn't work, Grennan came out from behind the shower curtain of his bathroom, and Officer Bowers fired.
You know, 1 out of 4, 1 out of 5 people that we may interact with on any given day, whether it be at work or not, have a disability or have some type of condition that impacts them.
So the United States Census report a few years back stated that at least 1 in 4 Americans are living with a disability. And that's simply based on self-reporting, which means that it's highly likely that those numbers are actually more significant than 1 in 4. And what that means is it's not a matter of if a law enforcement officer is going to be serving somebody with a disability, it's a matter of when and how frequently.
So people with disabilities make up the single largest minority group in the US. So officers really need to have the skill set to work with this population. If 25% of the people have some sort of disability, that's a big percentage of people that they're working with.
If you're working with the public and the community at large, that means 1 in 4 people that you're going to be exposed to in your work as a community service provider, as well as somebody who's an authoritarian. You're going to come across people who are going to have disabilities, and they're going to present themselves in different ways. The most important piece is being able to know that you live in a community where you're going to come in contact with people who have disabilities, and it is therefore your responsibility, if that is your professional career, to know who your people are and how to respectfully approach them and work with them.
I think any kind of background and experience in working with people with disabilities is going to be a plus. I think it's would be helpful for officers to be able to recognize when they're working with a person whose disability is limiting in a way that is going to make it difficult for that person either to communicate clearly with the officer or understand the officer, or to be able to comply with the officer. It may not be obvious when you first are interacting with that individual. Any kind of training that would help an officer to be able to quickly recognize, oh, the problem is not that this individual doesn't want to respond to me, it's that he can't hear me. Those sorts of things can lead to an escalation. If one gets impatient that someone is not following an instruction, people read those clues back and forth. And that can escalate.
I had something called a wellness check from a police officer in my town shortly after, actually the day my ex-husband left. I called my therapist, which I don't typically do, but I could tell I was headed into a crisis. And the phone died, and I didn't have a way to charge it because the power had been out. And it was my therapist's practice to have a wellness check. And in my 20 plus years of therapy, I'd never had or heard of a wellness check. And so there I was, like, in panic mode from what was going on personally, and there was an officer outside my house, and I thought I was in trouble. I didn't want to answer the door, and my landlord came in and explained why the officer was there, and had also said, look, if you don't let him in, he could potentially probably call a judge and get a warrant and come in and make sure you're okay. So he came in, and one of the first things and one of the most valuable things I think about this interaction being on the verge of a crisis was that he told me, you know, you're not in trouble or anything. It's you know, it's okay. He was really nice, and he sat next to me on the couch And he asked me probably the other most valuable thing I can mention, one of the other most valuable things I can mention. He asked me, what can I do to help? Like, how can I help you right now? I needed a little time to think about it and figure it out. And he was really patient and sat there while I kind of mulled it over. And I said, can you call my dad? Because I don't want to explain any of this to my dad. And so he did. He took my dad's business card and he called my dad and he spoke with him for, I don't know, over an hour about what it's like having daughters. And my dad informed him of my history and all of that stuff. And so he became a resource. One of the things he also said, which was a big takeaway for me, and I value it, is I have his business card in my wallet and his phone number in my phone. And if I was ever in a crisis again and needed a ride to the hospital to admit myself or had any kind of an issue where I needed help, he was a resource. And he knew my history and my trauma and the kind of person I was. I think he could see that I was also a human being, not just someone crazy in crisis, not thinking rationally. It meant a lot and it lasted, and I consider him as a safe person to go to, and that's really valuable for someone like me who has a mental illness and struggles at times, to have a support network, a steady, solid support network that's not going anywhere. I didn't feel as though I was in trouble or going to get in trouble or that I could be arrested. The language in which they spoke to me with was also non-judgmental and kind. I'm not sure how officers go about assessing these situations and how they approach, but there was something that was kind and calming about their tone, their asking me, how can I help? What can I do right now to ease, your fears? What can I do in the future? Or telling me I'm going to follow up with you. I didn't feel shamed and I didn't feel small or in trouble or anything like that. And so I was very lucky in those ways.
The most important thing that police officers can do to help them respond to people with disabilities in ways that are helpful and meaningful, and that is to know people with disabilities, to work with organizations like Disability Rights Vermont, and to be curious about the lives of people with disabilities, to examine and interrogate their own biases about people with disabilities, but really to get to know people and ask those people with disabilities, what they need.
Taking a step back and seeing, do I use this kind of language that may put someone down or make someone feel badly for what their mental health disability is? NAMI National has some really great resources where you can actually put in something like borderline personality disorder in NAMI search, and it will pull up a easy to read from the DSM, where all the diagnoses come from, an explanation of what that illness is. It can be something as simple as that. It can be asking someone in your personal life who is struggling, how do you want me to talk to you? What helps?
My name is Austin and I have autism, and it mainly affects me with processing. So sometimes it takes me a little longer to process just everything. So my first interaction with the police happened when I was 12 or 13 years old. I was going to Arlington High School, but as in 8th grade, as a middle and high school. And I was having a bad day, so I decided during the middle of this day at school, I decided to leave the campus. My therapist and several other of the teachers followed me as I left campus, and they were following along with me. And throughout that time, they must have called the police, and the state police showed up. And they pulled in front of me after I had walked away from school a little bit. And he immediately got out of his police car and approached me and put his hands on me, on my shoulder. I told him to take his hands off of me, and he held on to me tighter and told me to stop walking. I told him to take his hands off me again, and he squeezed my shoulder even tighter, and then I hit him. And after that, we got into a scuffle, and he threw me on the ground, and he pinned me on the ground. And I just remember I had one arm stretched out on the dirt, and the other one he had behind my back. Another officer, a female officer, arrived on scene. They lifted me up, and I just remember my bracelet fell off when they picked me up. I was just trying to grab it with my feet, and I did grab it with my feet, and they dragged me to the police car, and I just remember holding on to the bracelet with my feet. They then put me in the cop car, the rest of me in the cop car. They shut the door, and then I believe right after, the male police officer who I hit opened the door and elbowed me in the face, even though I was handcuffed and in the car. So she drove me back to the barracks, is what she called it. And throughout the time, she was berating me. When we arrived there, she got out of the police car, walked around and opened my door, and I was cowering away from her. And I had my face basically pressed against the glass as far away from her as I could have it. And she kept telling me to get out of the car. And because of my processing issue, I stayed silent for a little bit. And then eventually at some point I just started to say, I want my mom. Please, I want my mom. And she told me to get out of the car and that my mom was coming. I later found out that they had not even contacted her at that point. I was not resisting, and the female officer took out her pepper spray and sprayed me in the face. I remember it got in my eyes as well as my mouth. I couldn't breathe, it burned my throat. And they ripped me out of the car and kept berating me and saying if I tried anything or if I kept resisting or whatever, that they would pepper spray me again. And they dragged me into the barracks while I was screaming and crying. And then they put me in a holding cell for a couple minutes before they got a hose and a bucket, and they proceeded to take me outside. This happened in December in Vermont. I was wearing shorts and a t-shirt, and they hosed me down with ice cold water, like a dog. And then they brought me back inside and left me in the holding cell for quite some time. At no point did they really treat me like I was a child at the time. They treated me like a delinquent, like someone who, like a bad person was how, they treated me like I just committed some heinous crime. As far as I know, they're either still on the force or have retired.
So it's really important that officers ask about what the person's disability is. They know what their disability is, and it's not really fair for the officer to just kind of guess or to make assumptions. It makes a lot more sense for them to get the information that they need, which is ask the person, do you have a disability? And what is it that I can do to help you right now with your disability? Or is there anybody I can call? Like most people with a disability will have a plan for when they're in crisis. And usually if the police are there, there is some kind of crisis going on, whether it's a small crisis or a really big blown up crisis.
I'm a big fan of being truthful and direct with people. I think there's always a lot of concern of, geez, I don't want to say this or I don't want to say that because I might offend someone, I might trigger them. It kind of goes like to the old saying of you don't want to ask about suicide because you'll make someone suicidal. And that's, never has been the case, and it will never be the case. I think it should be coached in such a way as tried to do it in as best a fashion and as least offensively, but to be asking questions around what supports do they have? Do you have people that you work with?
It appears to me, or I'm seeing that you're having a lot of anxiety right now. How can I help with that while we talk? Do you have a treatment team? Do you struggle with a mental health issue? Can we help you contact someone on your mental health team?
At the same time, though, we also talk about it's really important that they don't say, I understand what you're going through, because they don't understand what they're going through. If they don't have a disability, they're not that person. Even if they did have a disability, everybody is different, and it's really important that police keep that in mind, that they, while they can be empathetic to a person, they don't understand what exactly that person is going through or what their life may be like. Most people will have some kind of a written plan with triggers, things to avoid saying to them, people who may be important for them to have available to talk with or to come to the scene. They'll have their medications, if they have any, if they're on any medications. There'll be lots of information in that plan, and so it's important the officer, first of all, finds out what the disability is, and then gets that additional information there may be other resources that they can rely on to help them resolve the situation, whatever it might be, whether it's small or big.
Do you want me to take a step back, or can I sit down with you? I'd love to talk with you or have a conversation with you. And I think when it's more of a conversation instead of an interrogation, or you feel as though you're being assessed and judged and evaluated, I think whatever that conversation is, hopefully officers can intersperse those questions instead of the very most direct, what's your diagnosis? Because clearly you're crazy or you're having a moment, or, I think it's again about that language.
To let them know, they're not in trouble. We're gonna just kind of have a regular conversation for a minute before we get into the reason why I'm here.
And maybe it's something that, no, I don't have those things. Well, I wonder if that you benefit from those things. Maybe we can help connect you with, some of those supports. See what kind of response I get from that.
Sometimes people are not ready for the solution. Sometimes people need to process or sit in their feelings or feel these emotions and have that support, whether it's an officer sitting quietly next to them while they feel the feelings. But I think that it can be a process for people, and the way in which we talk to each other is really important and can guide whether this person will continue to escalate or de-escalate.
And it's important for the police to understand that to ask questions and listen really carefully, but to notice that if notice any kind of visible disabilities, but also to ask the question, do you have a disability? We have to actually be willing to ask that question of everybody involved. And then to understand that even if somebody has a disability, they still have agency. So one of the things that happens to people with disabilities is when the police come, say for an example, there's a domestic violence, that if they're in a victim role, then if they have a visible disability, they're even further marginalized by the police. Sometimes when the police don't recognize that they actually can speak for themselves. So often the police might turn to the person who's actually causing the harm and ask them to speak for the person with a disability. And of course that just interrupts any chance that the person will have any kind of agency, get the justice that we promise them that they'll get, or maybe even be able to be in a safe situation.
Active listening doesn't mean just listen good. Active listening skills help slow a situation down. And when we're in a crisis, emotions are high, okay? When our emotions are high, our ability as human beings to be rational is low. The first imperative thing is trying to bring the high emotionality out of a situation. And how do we get that adrenaline down? How do we get that high emotion down? By taking some time, by slowing things down, by actively listening, by actively engaging with a person and trying to elicit more information. Because that's really what active listening does, is it helps to elicit more information, to gather information so that we can problem solve and work with a person to some type of resolution. Now we're at a better place to problem solve, to understand what the actual problem is, and then work with someone who's now in a better place to be more rational in their conversation as you've taken the emotions out of it. It's an incredibly useful skill, and it's a perishable skill. If you don't use it, you lose it. So it needs to be practiced as well.
As a police officer, my recommendation when they come to a scene, and they may have already been told by the dispatcher that they suspect or they're strong, or someone has said that someone's in a mental health or substance use crisis, to keep in mind that that individual may have had negative interactions in the past with law enforcement, or they may never have had any interaction directly with law enforcement. So when they approach the person, trying to connect with them on an individual basis, trying to give that person space, give that person time, keep the tone and the language, very level and very calm, and really, a lot of it really just comes down to listening. Being a good listener. Taking the time to take a breath and just give that individual a chance to say what's on their mind.
In those instances, it's just really important for police officers to slow down and to, as safely as possible, give the person space to try and rephrase, to try and put what they're saying in like clear, concise language, because it has definitely been my experience, just repeating the same thing over and over again is not going to help the person to understand. It's trying a different way to connect with how they process, to help them understand what's going on. It's wonderful that police officers are looking to get more training, because that training and education will help the interactions and will help people to feel less discriminated against.
The big thing that I have heard from officers is that they're really afraid they're going to say the wrong thing when they're talking with anybody with a disability. And it's really, I encourage them to just practice with family members or anybody. Just those active listening skills that we use every day that we may not be aware of, where you can still do your job and resolve the situation, but you can do it in a way that where you might use some different tactics, de-escalation tactics with a person with disabilities.
So person first language is putting the person before the disability, but it really is best to ask the person how they prefer to be referred to. Some people don't want their disability to be a defining characteristic of themselves. And then other people, they feel like their disability is a big part of who they are. And so it's something that they define for themselves. As, for example, some people say that they are autistic, other people prefer to be a person with autism.
And the goal of a lot of this work really is, we're talking about how do we support people? How do we help people through a crisis? Well, the main thing that you're trying to do is you're trying to help influence someone's behavior so that they can be safe. That's the ultimate goal. And so in order to do that, the best way to try to influence someone is if you have a relationship with them. And the basis of having a relationship, you have to build rapport. That's not going to happen if they perceive me as being disrespectful. And so if I'm talking with someone or referring to someone as, let's say, a schizophrenic or a borderline, that's not helpful. All I've done now is pigeonhole someone into, this is what defines you. This diagnosis or these set of behaviors are what define you. And that's not at all what it is. And that creates further stigma as well.
When I'm in a crisis, I'm hypersensitive to everything and everyone around me, and language is really important. And so that officer not saying, calm down, ma'am, or maybe you should be going to more therapy. Some of those offhanded types of suggestions, perhaps, that may come from a good place can actually be kind of stigmatizing or make a person feel as though you have a preconceived judgment of them, which can lead to a barrier in communication and a lack of trust. And when there's a police officer involved in a situation, the trust and that we put in them as the authority is really important. And so when we communicate, having that basic respect, because no matter what situation I'm in, I'm still a human and deserve to be spoken to with respect, just like anyone, no matter what my disability or struggle is.
Language is critical, and when it comes to people who have mental health issues, developmental disability, other types of disability issues, trauma, substance use, we don't want to be defined by our condition. In my case, I personally don't believe in mental illness. I don't believe in labels. However, the psychiatric world has put the label on me bipolar. So that's the label I carry. And at times people will they'll say to me, they'll say, Dan is bipolar. Well, no, Dan is not bipolar. Dan has a mental health condition that happens to have higher highs and lower lows. At the very least, if people would refer to me as a man, an individual who has a bipolar condition, they're at least depersonalizing. So in terms of law enforcement, if they can focus on the person as being separate from the condition, that's huge for many of us. Is not seeing that people define us as whatever our particular condition might be.
I was an addict for roughly 18 years. How you're approached by a law enforcement officer, person that is, obviously a person that is in active use of opiates or substance use disorders. For me, there was one positive reinforcement, but some of the negative stuff was the constant grilling. I mean, there was times where I was kind of felt forced upon that I was supposed to give this information that, I didn't have. For a run-in with one, they pulled me over because they knew that I was an active user. I wasn't doing nothing wrong, but, since I had multiple run-ins with one individual that, he felt it was okay to pull me over because he thought he was going to incriminate me with being in possession of something. There was other points in times, just the way that they talked, the demeanor. I mean, I was talked down upon. I wasn't treated as a human being. I was less than, and that's one of the biggest things as an addict is that, you're talking down to us. We already know we're already down at a low. We're at a point where, there's a reason why we're using, we're covering up trauma that we've endured over the years from childhood all the way up to recent. Instead of talking down to us, to actually talk to us like we're a human being, like we're a loved one, you'd get so much more out of us because, you're talking to us like we're somebody. We're not something that you step upon. At that point in time, I was about 32. And, I didn't know who I could turn to. I didn't have family. My family knew me as a thief, that I was less than. I was called every worthless name you could imagine. But, this one officer, he looked at me and talked to me like I was something, that he knew I could become something better than where I was. And just had a feeling I was in the rut. He wasn't sure what. He took a good amount of his time when I finally came forward because I didn't know who to turn to. And I turned to this officer that had me sit down and took the time out of his day and helped get me into a rehab. 8 years later, I still have a relationship with this officer that has been a hero to me because of the way that he talked to me. The way that he understands that addiction is a disease and that people can change. It's a way that you go forward talking to people, the way that you treat them really will show the way that we react because we're already down on a low. We're already feeling ashamed. We probably got caught for doing something that we're supposed to do in possession, but they don't know what we've gone through to get to that point in our life. The trauma that we've gone through, the emotions that we're trying to escape from. To talk to a person that they're less than, the only times that you run into them, you can't give up hope on somebody. We're all humans. We all deserve to live. We've just had a different hand dealt to us in life. Out there in the community, we're already stereotypes. Obviously we know you're the law, we're the bad guys, you're the good guys. And you don't know what type of mental health issues that we have going on and the severity of calling somebody, a junkie, a pillhead, a crackhead, a piece of garbage and so on and so forth. That triggers something in us where we rebel, whether it's lashing out at the officer, making a scene, things get a lot worse very quick. They don't know how quick a person could turn and, hurt them. It's not that we're trying to inflict harm or try to get away, but it's something that triggers when you call a person, a junkie, a pillhead, a crackhead, how belittled that makes a person feel. We need to be talked to like we're someone and not as a label. We're a human being that's just had an unfortunate event in our life that we found a way to escape from, to make ourselves feel better so we can be a normal person. Our guards are up so far that it just takes one simple word to set us off. You know, this officer, the way he spoke to me changed my life. He saved me. That's the reason why I'm alive today, because as an active addict, there's only jails, institutions, and deaths. And, you know, for me, jail wasn't really where I was looking at. You know, I've had plenty of time being arrested, but I was looking at death because I was using so much of that point in time in my life and felt comfortable with this officer because of the way he talked to me. Did he arrest me and have several run-ins with me? Yeah, definitely. Each time I've had the run-ins with him, you know, it wasn't where anything escalated because he talked to me in a way. He gave me a positive aspect. If I had to run in with him later on, I kind of was glad to see him. You know, this officer to this day, to me, is a hero. And I told this to his face that he is my hero. He's the reason why I'm here alive today, the reason why my children have their father around still. And if it wasn't the way he talked to me, he talked to me like how every other law enforcement interaction I had, I probably wouldn't be here talking to you right now.
Police involvement in and of itself can escalate folks. One of the ways in which they can make sure that they can convey to the individual that they're being heard and understood is to simply repeat what they've heard. For the police officer to say, this is what I'm hearing you say, and then repeat it back is just a really simple engagement tool that lets the individual know that they're being heard well.
You know, for example, I answer calls for the Warm Line, the Vermont Support Line, and I get calls where people are in a real state of crisis. Those calls tend to be the long calls because I need to give them the space up front to kind of vent and de-escalate from where they are in the moment, and then, you know, and then sort of work their way back down into a, you know, more stable, calm state. And typically, you know, with particularly someone who's in a higher end of crisis, that can take time. So I think patience actually is a key part of the equation when it comes to trying to de-escalate someone.
If somebody is shouting and talking, you know, up here to start up here, but then to bring them down, like you might if you were talking in a crowded bar, for example, and suddenly it got very quiet. People do it every day. It's just a matter of really thinking about what would work in this situation with this particular person.
You happen to be a police officer that has, you know, it's a canine unit. The dog could be something that could be really triggering to a person, could lead to behavioral reactions that might seem like, oh, someone's guilty, but really it's more fear. So just being aware of the external stimuli that could be influencing the individual and could end up escalating the situation.
The lights and siren can be very triggering. So if there's a way to, if you don't have to use those, to not use lights and siren. Even the buttons on their uniform, very shiny, very bright. Somebody could be on somebody on the spectrum may want to reach out and touch those buttons. And the officer, you know, usually they don't want to be touched, right, by anybody they're interacting with. But they just have to remember, like, okay, this is different. Like, this may be going on for this person. Or the person may, if they're having like auditory hallucinations, they may not be able to answer right away. They may be listening to voices. And it's not that they're disrespecting the officer or they don't want to answer them. It's that they have to take some time to answer it, because first they're going to hear the voices and then they're going to answer the question. And it's not that they're uncooperative. It's that they're going to take a little bit longer to really process my questions to them if I'm the officer, and that's okay. You know, it's got to be okay. And to not ask too many questions at once, to only have one person talking to them. If there's two officers responding, really one should take the lead and they shouldn't both be asking questions of the person at the same time. And if they can figure out who, if there's two of them, who is maybe have the better rapport with this person, have that person take the lead. If there's any kind of hook that they can find, that the person is interested, anything they're interested in that they can start talking about, you know, looking around at the surroundings. If they're in the person's home and they can see the books on the bookshelf, or maybe there's pictures of baseball players, or, you know, whatever it might be, and say, hey, are you into baseball? You know, who do you like? What team do you like? and just start talking about something that maybe has nothing to do with the reason why they're there, but it'll put the person at ease so that then they can get to talking about why the police are there. So when police respond to what they know is going to be a person with a disability, it's really important that they remember the training about working with people with disabilities, because most of their training is about taking control of a scene and being in charge. It's totally different when they're responding to somebody with a disability. If they're in crisis, they've got to really turn that switch and become much softer. They've got to just do a lot of little things that will make the situation a lot easier, like getting down to the person's level, like sitting down with them as opposed to towering over them. No sing-songy voice. People, I think, tend to suddenly start talking louder to people with a disability, even though they can hear perfectly fine. And it's really just remembering those cues, remembering that, all right, this is different, and that the fact that their uniform may be intimidating, and it may be a lot easier to get the answers that they're looking for or the information that they need if they just sort of take it back a notch, just kind of take a deep breath and remember, like, okay, I have time, I can use some space here, and it may take a little bit longer to communicate with this person, but I can take that time as an officer. I can just, it's okay. I don't have to rush through this. It's not a criminal matter. It's usually not a criminal matter. It's usually a community caretaking function. And so there isn't a big hurry. You're not like chasing a bad guy. You're just trying to talk to somebody and make sure that they're okay. And so those little things that an officer can do can be really important. And just to think about, if they can, just try to put themselves in that person's shoes and how they would be perceiving somebody coming in with not only a uniform, but a gun. Like, the people may have extreme reaction to just the tools on their tool belt, that to an officer it's just part of their uniform, but to a person with a disability it may be a really scary thing, and they've got to just adjust for that.
Probably one of the best things I could recommend to folks is it's 100% of your attention in that moment. The person who's in crisis, 100% of your attention. You also need, if you have another officer with you or other people with you, they can manage the scene, they can be watching for other things, but as much, if not 100% of your attention is on, the individual in crisis. We can also make a situation much worse if I'm responding to my radio or checking my cell phone or getting a text to see what that is. All of those kind of things indicate I'm not paying attention to you. Your issue isn't as important to me because I'm responding to other things. And so I need to make sure, A, that I'm giving you all my attention and I'm treating you with respect. That, to me, is the crux of de-escalation. And from a human being brain functioning perspective, it's almost physically impossible to be assaultive towards someone that you feel is treating you respectfully. It has this two-way thing. One, it's a protective factor for the officer or the person trying to de-escalate a situation, because with respect comes a lowered risk of someone being assaultive towards me. But also, I'm treating you with respect. And so that's helping to build rapport, which is helping us to have a relationship, which is the only way, really, I'm going to influence your behavior to try and change it so that we can have a safe resolution to a crisis. That's why one of the things I will say to people when I'm dealing with a situation is, you have every right to feel X. If they're angry and upset, I'll tell them, you have every right to be upset. Now let's talk about how we're dealing with that. Because you don't have a right to assault someone because you're upset. You don't have a right to threaten, those kind of things. But my point is, I want to validate them by saying, you have every right. So I respect you. I respect what you believe in. You have those belief systems, and so you have every right to feel the way you feel. Now let's work on how we deal with that.
Slow everything down and respect that person's comfort zone and keep your distance. That's immediately what you should do when you come to a scene. And officers are really there in their roles as guardians and caretakers, and they should act like it. They shouldn't be a show of force. One of the things that law enforcement officers are trained to do is use command presence, which usually is just talking in a loud, authoritative voice. And we've trained officers that that's not going to be effective with people who might have a mental impairment, or depending on the disability, it may not be effective. But in terms of de-escalation, sometimes time is your best friend. Sometimes questions that are just yes or no might be helpful for people who are in crisis as well. Like I tell officers in training, if you met one person with a mental impairment, or if you met one person with a disability, you've met just one person. We're not all the same. But you have huge powers of observation to figure out, maybe what's going on with this person. We've also, trained officers about the requirements of the Americans with Disabilities Act, which requires reasonable accommodations, which are really a change in your standard policies, practices, and regulations on a case-by-case basis to deal with the person that you're dealing with. We also tell people that these incidences, these kinds of encounters are going to take longer than you're typically aware of, and that you should not be focused on how long it's taking. You should be focused on resolving the encounter in a way that does the least amount of harm to everybody.
One other thing that officers can do that's really helpful is if they have to transport somebody. Usually if they have to transport somebody, again, it's a scary situation for anybody. And the person is not in control. They're put in the back of a car and they're going to be driven somewhere. One little thing is just ask them, what radio station would you like to listen to? Or what kind of music would you like? And they can turn on the music, and it's a tiny little thing, but it gives the person in the back seat that little bit of control that they think is, everything is out of control all of a sudden because they're being taken somewhere. And they're with a police officer, but all of a sudden they have a choice in the music. And that can make a big difference and can help sort of calm them down if that's what they need right then.
When approaching someone who is having a mental health crisis, to prevent them from continuing to escalate, I think asking them what helps them. I think asking them, what are you feeling right now? If they say, I'm afraid of you, then you work on a strategy or a coping skill to help them feel less fearful, which may be, let me sit on the ground next to you, or let me step back while I speak to you, or whatever those tactics or strategies are. I think asking that person in crisis, what are you feeling immediately right now that I can help you with? Telling them, look, we can't fix everything right now together, but we can take it one step at a time and one moment at a time. So in this moment right now, or what we can do next is X, Y, Z. Here are your choices. What do you feel better about? What do you have questions about? Posing these options, coming across as being non-threatening, letting people feel validated even if their thinking isn't matching reality in that moment, just to get them safe and everybody safe into the proper treatment. Sometimes just saying, yeah, I felt that way too, even if you haven't, may actually be helpful if you can say it in a genuine and supportive way. Or, I've never felt that way before, but I bet it's hard. And so I think observing what helps for you, asking people in your personal life, what helps for you when you feel your emotions getting out of control. I think we can learn a lot from the people around us and asking them questions.
We also know that people who have disabilities experience sexual violence at exponentially higher rates than the non-disabled population. And so it's important for police officers to have an understanding of the issue of sexual violence, as including sexual violence as it happens to somebody who's got a disability, especially if that person who's causing the harm is the primary caregiver. But there's also times when somebody with a disability's story is discounted by police officers because they don't understand the way that the disability, for example, impacts their ability to tell the story. So that's why it's really important for us to make sure that police officers in our state and our communities have the right kind of training and the right kind of experiences, so they can recognize the ways that people with disabilities might be talking about their experience of harm, or the way that they might experience that harm.
We worked in a case once where an individual who had a developmental disability needed to be moved from one location to another. The caregivers that ordinarily would have done that were facing obstinance on the part of the individual. When police were called, the person backed into a space and had no idea really what was going on and what was being asked of him. And he ended up being tased despite the fact that the officer warned him that he would be tased. What the officer did would have been reasonable had there been a person who understood and who was willfully non-compliant with a reasonable order. But in this case, the individual had no idea what really was going on. When the individual saw the little red dot on his body from the taser targeting device, he tried to brush it off. So he didn't know what was going on. And whatever was said didn't get through to him.
This incident has given me a lot of long-term negative effects in my life, severe PTSD. I think police officers definitely need to keep in mind the long-term effects that how they handle a situation can have on people. They definitely hold all of the power in these situations, and how they react will define how other people live for the rest of their lives.
My suggestion would be that they become a big brother, an advocate, some kind of connection personally with someone who has a disability for a minimum of 6 months so that they can begin to understand what it's like to coexist with someone who has any type of disability, autism. If they don't know how an autistic child behaves, they're not going to be able to manage that autistic child in a respectful and humane way when they have to manage that kid's behavior. Just like practicing their guns, they need to practice working with people with disabilities. It's a skill. It's something you need to do as a professional. And if 1 in 4 people in our communities have a disability, it's essential that these officers be given the right training to work with all people, not just, I'm going to put this in big quotes, normal people. How you speak to that person in the moment. It's the language that you use. You cannot use the same language that you might use with someone who doesn't have an intellectual disability or someone who versus somebody who does. They hear things differently, and often through the synapses gets twisted and they don't understand. So the more confusion to an already upset person will just exacerbate the situation. The police officer gets excited, uses the same language, only more aggressively. That spins the person into another level, and that's where we end up with the acceleration. If we can start with the right language when you're speaking to someone with a disability, and how you get answers from them by asking the right questions in a way that isn't threatening, you might diffuse a situation, help the person solve his problem, look at it with a compassionate eye first. Use the right language first. And if that doesn't work, or if you realize you're dealing with another situation and not the disabled person, then you can go back to your training. But you need to be trained that way too. It's a dual training. We can't control other people. Other people have to control themselves, but we can set up an environment that is conducive to helping that person calm and center. It's like meeting somebody exactly head on, right where they're at, saying, if you're saying the same thing that they are, they know you hear them. And that's how you connect.
I mean, if I were to sum it up, I would say, 1, you need to slow down. 2, you can't be just focused on how long it's taking. 3, the resolution is not going to look the same in these cases that you're typically aware of, where you're hauling somebody off to jail, or you're just citing them or telling them not to do it again. It's going to look different, and oftentimes you might want to bring in community partners to help you figure out a resolution.
It's just so important to treat people with respect, and to not be afraid to ask questions and to find out more about the people in their community that they're serving. That'll really help them in the long run when they have to respond to individuals. This is the great thing about working in Vermont, is it's such a small place. Generally, police are assigned to a pretty confined area, and they can get to know the people in the community, and it can be really helpful down the road. And if it's not specific people, it's at least specific resources that are available where they could find out about various things that are available to people with disabilities, so that will help them do their job better, I think.
It's all too common that we like to problem solve right away, but if we don't listen carefully or actively and really determine what the actual problem is, we're wasting our time problem solving the wrong problem. And so it's really important to slow things down, gather that information, treat people respectfully, and that will take you very far, because that's the tool that you're going to use every day.
If they have time and can do just a little bit of volunteer work in the mental health or homeless community, just to have some, just to be in that community, but wearing a totally different hat, a totally different context. The more they can work toward developing empathy, putting themselves in the shoes of the individual they're dealing with, the more they can practice active listening and taking the time to hear where that person is at and what their issue is. And then, of course, taking advantage of the training opportunities that are becoming more and more available here in the United States for law enforcement. I think all of those would help tremendously in terms of building the skill set, building the awareness that's really optimal for a first responder when they're interacting with someone out in the community that's dealing with some major issue.
Try not to judge a book by its cover. We all look very different or appear very different in different situations, especially if we're stressed or overwhelmed or having intense emotions. But I'm really grateful for the interactions with the police, and I think I appreciate it and proud and happy that I can consider these officers in my town as like a support network. And I hope that as you all train, you keep that in mind, that we're all people and we all need help, and no matter what we look like or how we present or what our disability is, kindness and compassion can go a long way.